A powerful judge slams her gavel down, sentencing a black honor student to prison, convinced she's just another criminal. 5 years, no parole. The courtroom erupts, but the judge barely flinches. Justice has been served, or so she thinks. But a decade later, the past comes roaring back. Her own grandson is arrested, and when she turns to the best defense attorney in the state, she freezes, because it's her. The same girl she locked away, now the most formidable lawyer in the courtroom. Will she take the case? Or will she let the judge finally feel the weight of her own verdict? This story will take you on a journey of power, redemption, and the price of justice. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 2B opened with a solemn creak as Judge Margaret Caldwell entered. Her black robe swished against the polished floor, commanding attention without a word. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the tense faces in the room. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, a stark contrast to the gravity of the proceedings about to unfold. "All rise," Bailiff Robert Hayes called out, his deep voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. The Honorable Judge Margaret Caldwell presiding. The sound of chairs scraping and bodies rising filled the air like a nervous whisper. Margaret's steel-gray eyes swept across the courtroom as she took her seat, her practiced gaze noting every detail, every face. The familiar weight of authority settled around her shoulders like a comfortable blanket. She'd presided over hundreds of cases in this very room, and this one would be no different. Her fingers brushed against the smooth wooden gavel, a gesture that had become almost ritualistic over her years on the bench. At the defense table, 17-year-old Imani Douglas sat ramrod straight in her navy blue blazer, her hands clasped tightly in her lap until her knuckles showed white. Her public defender, Michael Reed, shuffled through a messy stack of papers, dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. A coffee-stained legal pad peeked out from beneath the chaos. Behind them, Imani's mother Lillian pressed a crumpled tissue to her mouth, trying to hold back her tears, her wedding ring catching the morning light as her hand trembled. "You may be seated," Margaret announced, her voice crisp and clear as breaking ice. Prosecutor David Whitman rose smoothly to his feet, adjusting his expensive silk tie with practiced ease. His Italian leather shoes gleamed in the morning light. "Your Honor, the state is ready to proceed." His confident smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he glanced at the jury, already sizing them up like pieces on a chessboard. "The defense is ready, Your Honor," Michael Reed said, his voice less assured, almost apologetic. A paper slipped from his stack, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. He scrambled to retrieve it, his face flushing red. As the trial began, Whitman painted his picture with careful strokes, each word chosen for maximum impact. The evidence will show that on April 15th, a substantial amount of illegal substances was found in a vehicle where Ms. Douglas was a passenger. The state will prove beyond reasonable doubt that she was not merely present, but complicit. Imani's fingers dug into the wooden table, leaving half-moon impressions in her palms. Her shoulders trembled slightly, but she held her head high, the gold beads in her braided hair catching the light with each subtle movement. Through the morning, Whitman presented his case with theatrical precision. Margaret watched him lay out evidence bags, call witnesses, show photographs. She'd seen this dance before, young people caught up in drugs throwing away their futures. Her pen scratched against her notepad, recording the familiar rhythm of prosecution and defense. When it was the defense's turn, Michael Reed stumbled through his cross-examinations like a man walking through darkness. "But you didn't actually see my client with any drugs, did you?" he asked a police officer, his question lacking the sharp edge needed to make an impact. His tie had come slightly loose and sweat beaded on his forehead. "No, but she was in the car where we found them," the officer replied firmly, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Imani's moment to testify came just before lunch. She stood in the witness box, her voice clear despite her obvious fear, her school honor society pin glinting on her blazer lapel. "I was just getting a ride home from study group," she explained, her dark eyes pleading with every face in the jury box. "I didn't know there were any drugs in that car. I'm an honor student. I've never even seen drugs before. I was studying for my AP chemistry test that night." Margaret studied the girl's face, searching for signs of deception. She'd heard similar stories countless times before. Young people always had excuses, always claimed innocence. The law was the law, and Margaret had sworn to uphold it without prejudice or favor. Her fingers drummed silently against her bench. The jury took only 2 hours to return their verdict. The foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in his hand, avoiding Imani's desperate gaze. "We find the defendant guilty." A wail broke from behind the defense table. Lillian Douglas collapsed forward, her sobs echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom like a wounded animal's cry. Her Bible fell from her lap, landing with a dull thud on the floor. Margaret straightened her spine, fixing Imani with an unwavering stare. Her voice carried the weight of decades of similar pronouncements. "The court sentences you to 5 years imprisonment, no possibility of parole?" "No!" Imani's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to her mother, mascara leaving dark trails on her cheeks. "Mama, please, I didn't do it. I swear to God, I didn't do it." "She's just a child," Lillian screamed, rising to her feet, her chair scraping backward. "She's innocent. Lord Jesus, she's innocent." Margaret's gavel crashed down, the sound like a thunderclap in the charged atmosphere. Order in the court. As the bailiff moved to handcuff Imani, the metal clicking ominously in the tense air, her eyes locked with Margaret's. They were filled with something beyond fear or anger, a desperate plea for understanding, for mercy, for justice, the look of someone watching their future crumble before them. Margaret didn't flinch. She'd made her decision. Justice had been served, hadn't it? Without another word, she rose and strode toward her chambers, her robes billowing behind her like dark wings, leaving behind the sounds of Imani's sobs and her mother's prayers. The heavy door closed behind her with a final decisive click. Margaret Caldwell's heels clicked against the marble floor of her foyer as she entered her spacious suburban home. The silence wrapped around her like a familiar embrace, broken only by the distant hum of her top-of-the-line security system. She hung her black robe in the closet, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle, and made her way to the kitchen, where a bottle of Merlot waited on the granite countertop. The wine made a gentle gurgling sound as she poured it into a crystal glass, one from the set her colleagues had given her upon her appointment to the bench. The rich aroma filled her nostrils, promising relaxation after a long day of maintaining order in her courtroom. She carried the glass to her study, where leather-bound law books lined dark wooden shelves, arranged by subject and year, just as they had been for the past 2 decades. Settling into her favorite leather chair, Margaret let out a long breath. The chair creaked softly, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat, as she reached for the stack of case files on her mahogany desk. Her fingers moved mechanically through the papers, signing where needed, making notes in her precise handwriting, each letter perfectly formed as she'd been taught in finishing school. The Douglas case file sat among them, unremarkable in its manila folder, just one more in the endless stream of cases that crossed her desk. Margaret barely glanced at it as she moved it aside. Just another case, another conviction, another day upholding the law that had defined her life for so long. Her eyes caught sight of a newspaper article placed neatly on the corner of her desk, its crisp folds revealing Andrea Pierce's careful touch. Her diligent young clerk must have left it there, knowing the judge's preference for staying informed. Margaret picked it up more out of habit than interest. The headline made her pause, the black letters stark against the white paper. Imani Douglas, the bright mind Harvard lost. She took a sip of wine, her eyes scanning the text while her manicured fingernail traced each line. The words seemed to leap off the page, demanding her attention. Top of her class, perfect SAT scores, full scholarship to Harvard Law. Margaret's hand tightened around her wine glass, her knuckles whitening. The article detailed Imani's academic achievements: president of the debate club, winner of the state mock trial competition, volunteer at the local legal aid clinic. A photo showed Imani in her debate team blazer, holding a trophy, her smile bright and full of promise, her eyes shining with the same determination Margaret once saw in her own mirror. Margaret's chest tightened, a pressure building beneath her designer blouse. She set down her wine glass with more force than necessary, dark liquid sloshing against the crystal, threatening to stain her pristine desk calendar. The scholarship revoked, the acceptance withdrawn, a future in law destroyed. All with the bang of her gavel. For a moment, Margaret saw herself at 17, ambitious, determined, dreaming of justice in her father's study. But she'd had opportunities. She'd had chances. She'd had privilege she'd never questioned until this moment. "The law is the law," she muttered, pushing the article away with trembling fingers that betrayed her uncertainty. But her hand trembled slightly as she did so, and the words felt like ashes in her mouth. Rising from her chair, Margaret switched off her desk lamp, leaving only the soft glow of her desk clock illuminating the room. The darkness didn't bring its usual comfort. She walked through her quiet house, past framed certificates and awards that suddenly seemed to dim, past photos of herself with Supreme Court justices and governors whose smiles now looked more like grimaces. In her bedroom, she went through her nightly routine mechanically, each motion a practiced dance. Silk pajamas from her favorite boutique, expensive face cream that promised to keep time at bay, perfectly arranged pillows on her bed, each one fluffed and positioned just so. But as she lay in her king-sized bed, surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets, sleep refused to come. The ceiling seemed to mock her as she stared up at it, shadows dancing across the crown molding. The usual peace of her evening routine had abandoned her, leaving behind an unfamiliar disquiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Imani's face, not the defiant defendant in her courtroom, but the bright-eyed girl from the photograph, clutching her debate trophy, dreams still intact, future still unbroken. Margaret turned onto her side, then her other side, seeking comfort that eluded her. The silk sheets rustled with each movement, a whispered reminder of her restlessness. "The law is the law," she whispered again into the darkness, her voice small and uncertain. But the words that had comforted her for decades now rang hollow in her ears, echoing with the weight of consequences she'd never before allowed herself to consider. For the first time in years, sleep eluded Judge Margaret Caldwell, leaving her alone with thoughts she couldn't gavel into silence. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered on at 6 a.m., but Imani Douglas had been awake for hours, her mind refusing to grant her even a moment's peace. Her first night in prison had been a blur of muffled sobs and racing thoughts, punctuated by the occasional shout or metallic clang from somewhere in the facility. The thin mattress felt like concrete against her back, and the scratchy blanket offered little comfort against the perpetual chill of the cell. At 7 a.m., she opened her eyes to find her cellmate, Maria Torres, already dressed and watching her with a mix of pity and amusement. Her orange jumpsuit was perfectly pressed, suggesting years of practice. "First day? You'll get used to it. Or you won't." Maria's voice was rough but not unkind, carrying the weight of experience. Imani sat up slowly, her head spinning from exhaustion and disbelief. Just yesterday, she'd been organizing her Harvard acceptance materials, arranging them lovingly in a special folder. Now she was here, surrounded by cold gray walls and steel bars that cast zebra-striped shadows across the floor. "Processing time, new fish," a guard barked, appearing at their cell door with a ring of jangling keys. Imani followed mechanically as they led her through a series of stark corridors, the sound of her rubber shoes echoing against the concrete. The processing room smelled of antiseptic and fear, mixed with the sharp tang of industrial cleaner. They handed her an orange jumpsuit that was too big, the fabric stiff and uncomfortable against her skin like cardboard. "Arms up," ordered the guard, her face an expressionless mask. Imani complied as they took her fingerprints, each digit pressed firmly into black ink that seemed to stain more than just her skin. "Inmate number 24,601, they announced, as if her name no longer mattered, as if 18 years of being Imani Douglas had simply evaporated. The cafeteria was a cacophony of clanking trays and harsh voices bouncing off the high ceiling. Imani stood in line, her stomach churning at the sight of the gray-brown mess they called food. She couldn't bring herself to eat, just pushed the mystery meat around with her plastic spork, watching it leave greasy trails on the tray. "Hey!" A sharp voice cut through her daze. A tall inmate with tattoos crawling up her neck had bumped into her tray, sending beans sliding across her jumpsuit like brown tears. The woman towered over her, sneering. "Watch where you're going, princess." Maria appeared at her side like a guardian angel, her presence steady and sure. "Don't show weakness," she whispered urgently, her breath warm against Imani's ear. "Stand up straight. Look her in the eye." Imani's heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin and met the woman's gaze, forcing herself not to blink or look away. After what felt like hours, the other inmate snorted and walked away, her shoulders rolling like a predator's. Later that afternoon, Lillian visited. The sight of her mother's tear-stained face behind the thick glass nearly broke her. They picked up the phones on either side of the partition, the plastic warm from previous conversations. "Baby, I'm trying everything," Lillian's voice crackled through the receiver, thick with emotion. "We're going to appeal. Your lawyer says—" "Mom," Imani cut her off, her voice flat and lifeless. "It's over. Harvard's gone. Everything's gone." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, bitter and choking. "Don't say that." Lillian pressed her hand against the glass, leaving a ghostly print. "We're not giving up. You hear me? We're not giving up." But Imani had already given up. She could see it in the way the guards looked through her as if she were invisible, in the way Warden Brooks had processed her paperwork without a second glance, in the way her inmate number had replaced her name like a brand. That night she lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling where previous inmates had marked their days with tiny scratches. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her like a tomb. Somewhere down the cell block someone was crying, the sound echoing through the darkness. Another inmate was shouting curses at no one in particular. A guard's boots echoed on metal walkways, a rhythmic reminder of her confinement. Her future, the one filled with law books and ivy-covered buildings, of justice and purpose, had vanished like smoke in a strong wind. All that remained was this: a cell, a number, and endless gray days stretching before her like an empty road. Maria's voice drifted up from the lower bunk, gentle in the darkness. "First night's the hardest. Try to sleep." But Imani just kept staring upward, feeling nothing at all, as if everything that made her who she was had been stripped away along with her freedom. The prison yard stretched out under the harsh summer sun, a concrete wasteland dotted with clusters of orange-clad inmates. Imani Douglas stood alone, her back against the chain-link fence, watching the guards patrol above. Her once soft features had hardened and her eyes carried a sharpness that hadn't been there a year ago. The heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, but she barely noticed it anymore. She'd learned the rules quickly. Never show weakness. Never trust easily. Never let your guard down. The scared 17-year-old honor student was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who understood survival. Each day had taught her another lesson, carved another piece of wisdom into her soul with brutal efficiency. "Fresh meat," someone muttered nearby. Imani's attention shifted to the yard entrance where a young girl stumbled through, her orange jumpsuit still crisp and new. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, with trembling hands and red-rimmed eyes, her shoulders hunched inward as if trying to make herself invisible. Warden Brooks stood beside the new arrival, his face a mask of indifference. "Carter, welcome to your new home." His voice dripped with sarcasm as he gestured around the yard. "Your Harvard education won't help you here, Douglas," he added, catching Imani's eye with a smirk. The comment bounced off her like everything else these days. Imani watched as the new girl, Janie Carter, made her way across the yard. She recognized that lost look, the same one she'd worn a year ago when her world had crumbled around her. 3 older inmates began circling Janie like vultures, their intentions clear. Their predatory movements were all too familiar in this concrete jungle. "Hey, princess," one of them called out, her voice sweet but laced with menace. "Got any commissary money for us?" Janie backed away, right into another inmate. I don't..." Her voice quivered like a leaf in autumn. Without thinking, Imani pushed off from the fence. In long, confident strides, she crossed the yard and positioned herself between Janie and the others. "Back off," she said, her voice low but firm. "She's with me." Her stance was relaxed but ready, a subtle warning learned from countless yard confrontations. The older inmates hesitated. Imani's reputation had grown over the past year. She wasn't someone to mess with anymore. After a tense moment, they skulked away, finding easier prey. Their retreating glares promised future trouble, but Imani could handle that. Janie's eyes were wide with gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm Janie." Her hand still trembled, but less now. "I know," Imani replied, scanning the yard for other threats. "Stick close to me. You'll learn." She recognized her younger self in Janie's frightened eyes. That night, after lights out, Imani lay on her bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of the prison, the distant clang of metal doors, the shuffle of guards' footsteps, the muffled sobs of new inmates. Janie's arrival had stirred something in her, memories of that first terrible night, of the confusion and injustice that had brought her here. The weight of those memories pressed against her chest. She slipped out of bed and pulled out a worn law book she'd borrowed from the prison library. Under the dim light filtering through the cell window, she began to read. The legal terms were complex, but she was determined to understand them, to understand what had happened to her and why. Each page brought new challenges, but also new understanding. As she traced her finger along the pages, something sparked inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her conviction. Purpose, determination, fire. The words on the page began to make sense in ways they hadn't before, pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. The system had failed her, but she wouldn't fail herself. And maybe, just maybe, she could help others like Janie along the way. If no one else would fight for her, she would fight for herself. She would become the advocate she never had. In the darkness of her cell, Imani's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose as she continued to read, page after page, preparing for a battle she was only beginning to understand. The night stretched ahead, full of possibilities and promises of change. The crystal glasses clinked together as laughter echoed across the private country club's dining room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden tables where Margaret Caldwell sat with her former colleagues. The scent of expensive coffee and fresh-baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the subtle perfumes and colognes of the distinguished crowd. Henry Lawson, his white hair neatly combed and his bow tie perfectly straight, raised his water glass. His gold cufflinks caught the light as he gestured. "Remember that drug dealer who thought he could charm his way out of a sentence?" he chuckled. "Not in your courtroom, Margaret." Margaret smiled, smoothing her silk blouse. The pearls at her neck gleamed softly. "The law is the law," she said, her voice carrying the same authority it had held for decades on the bench. "Those criminals needed to learn actions have consequences. We made sure of that." Around the table, other retired judges nodded in agreement. They were all part of the old guard, proud of their tough stances and harsh sentences. The waiters moved silently around them, refilling water glasses and clearing plates with practiced efficiency, their black uniforms stark against the cream-colored walls. "To Margaret," Henry proclaimed, lifting his glass higher, "the toughest judge in the district." The praise wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket, familiar and well-earned. This was her world, respected, admired, surrounded by people who understood the importance of maintaining order. She took a small sip of her iced tea, savoring the moment and the gentle murmur of conversation around her. The drive home was pleasant, with Margaret humming along to classical music on the radio. Mozart's gentle melodies filled her luxury sedan as familiar landmarks passed by. Her house stood waiting, a stately colonial that represented decades of hard work and dedication to justice, its brick facade glowing in the late afternoon sun. She had just settled into her favorite armchair, a leather piece worn smooth by years of use, when her phone rang. Seeing Elaine's name on the screen made her pause. Her daughter rarely called during working hours. A faint sense of unease crept into her stomach. "Hello, Elaine," Margaret answered, her tone measured as always. "Mom?" Elaine's voice cracked. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Margaret sat up straighter, her fingers tightening around the phone, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into the case. "What is it?" she asked, her judicial calm slipping slightly. "It's Ben." Elaine's words came out in a sob. "He's been arrested." Margaret's hand found the kitchen counter, gripping it hard. The room seemed to tilt sideways as the words sank in. Ben, her grandson, the boy who'd played in her garden, who'd sat in her courtroom after school drawing pictures while she worked, who was supposed to be starting college in the fall, arrested. The family photos on her wall seemed to stare down at her accusingly. "What?" The word came out barely above a whisper, her throat suddenly dry. "They found drugs in his car," Elaine choked out. Mom, please, I need your help. We need you. Margaret's perfectly ordered world cracked like fine china hitting marble floors. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she'd been bragging about her tough sentences, especially in drug cases. Now her own grandson sat in a cell, probably scared and alone. Her fingers clutched the counter harder, her knuckles turning white. All those years of justice served suddenly felt different when it was Ben's future at stake. The weight of every harsh sentence she'd ever handed down seemed to press against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Margaret Caldwell's heels clicked sharply against the police station's linoleum floor as she marched toward the front desk, her usual composure replaced by a wild urgency she'd never experienced before. The familiar smell of disinfectant and stale coffee filled her nostrils, but now it made her stomach turn, as she couldn't help but reflect on the countless times she had sat in her chambers, knowing families were going through this very scene in the holding cells below her courtroom. "I'm here to see Benjamin Caldwell," she demanded, her voice carrying the same authority she had wielded in her courtroom for decades. "I'm his grandmother, Judge Margaret Caldwell." The desk sergeant barely looked up. "Sign in here, ma'am." Elaine stood nearby, wringing her hands, her mascara running and leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. "Mom, thank God you're here." Detective Marcus Boyd appeared, his face expressionless as he led them down a narrow hallway, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "The evidence is pretty clear-cut, Judge Caldwell. The drugs were found in his car during a routine traffic stop." Margaret's throat tightened. Those words. How many times had she heard prosecutors use them to justify convictions? Now, she felt the crushing weight of helplessness that came with standing on this side of the law. They reached the holding cell where Ben sat on a metal bench, his college sweater wrinkled and his usually perfectly styled hair a mess. When he saw them, he tried to smile. "Grandma, Mom, it's really not a big deal, just a misunderstanding." "Not a big deal?" Detective Boyd's voice was cold. "Felony drug possession with intent to distribute. The amount found in your vehicle carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years if convicted." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. 10 years. The same sentence she had handed down countless times, believing she was serving justice. But now she was just a grandmother, watching her grandson's future crumble before her eyes. "But he's just a boy," Elaine whispered, echoing words Margaret had dismissed so many times before. Ben's facade cracked and fear crept into his eyes. The same fear Margaret had seen in hundreds of young faces before, the fear she had always interpreted as guilt. He squeezed her hand. "Grandma, I'm scared." Margaret swallowed hard. She had heard those words before, from other children, other families. She had never truly listened. Now they pierced her heart like a knife, as she realized the weight of her own past decisions and the devastating impact they had on young lives. Margaret Caldwell sat rigidly in the public defender's cramped office, her fingers drumming against her designer handbag. The space was a far cry from her former chambers. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and case files were stacked haphazardly on every surface. The walls were bare except for a crooked diploma and a faded motivational poster that had seen better days. Tyler Grant, Ben's appointed lawyer, shuffled papers nervously. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the office's chilly air. His tie was slightly askew, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. I'm still reviewing the case," he stammered, avoiding direct eye contact. Margaret narrowed her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You mean to tell me you're not prepared?" "Mom," Elaine interrupted, her voice tight with anxiety. She reached out to touch her mother's arm. "Maybe we should—" "No." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor. "This is unacceptable. I'm going to speak with the prosecutor myself." The walk to David Whitman's office felt endless. The courthouse halls she'd once strode through confidently now seemed to mock her with their imposing marble walls. Margaret remembered him from countless cases, always sharp, always ruthless. But she'd been the judge then. She'd had the power. Now her heels clicked uncertainly against the floor. David's office was everything Tyler's wasn't. Spacious, well-lit, with a view of the city. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase on his polished desk. He barely looked up from his computer when Margaret entered, his fingers continuing to type for a moment longer than necessary. "Judge Caldwell," To what do I owe the pleasure? His voice carried just a hint of condescension. Margaret straightened her spine, squaring her shoulders like she used to do on the bench. David, this is about my grandson, Benjamin Caldwell. There's been a terrible mistake. Has there? David finally turned to face her, his expression neutral, but his eyes glinted with something that made her uneasy. He's a good boy, Margaret insisted, her voice taking on an unfamiliar pleading tone. He comes from a respectable family. This is clearly a misunderstanding. The evidence suggests otherwise. We found significant quantities of controlled substances in his possession. The law is quite clear on this matter. He tapped his pen against a thick case file. Surely there's room for discretion, Margaret pressed, leaning forward slightly. Consider his future. He's just starting college. He has so much potential. A cold smile spread across David's face, the kind she'd seen him use on defendants countless times before. Funny, that's what every mother and grandmother told you when they begged for mercy in your courtroom. Margaret felt her face flush, heat creeping up her neck. This is different. Is it? David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous tone. His perfectly knotted tie seemed to mock her. Because from where I sit, this is exactly the same. Except now you're on the other side of the bench. I was a fair judge, Margaret protested, but her voice wavered slightly, betraying her uncertainty. Your grandson will get the same system you swore by, David said, his words like ice. Every mandatory minimum, every zero-tolerance policy, every tough-on-crime stance you championed. He'll get all of it. Justice is blind, after all. Isn't that what you always said? Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped her purse, her knuckles turning white. The weight of every harsh sentence she'd handed down seemed to press against her shoulders. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her steps unsteady. For the first time in her life, Margaret Caldwell felt the full force of the system she'd helped build, and it terrified her. The sound of David's satisfied chuckle followed her down the hallway like a ghost. Margaret sat in her parked car, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The evening sun glinted off the modern glass building before her, making the gold-plated sign shine. Douglas and Associates, criminal defense attorneys. Her stomach churned as she read the name over and over, each letter a reminder of her past decisions. This can't be happening, she whispered to herself, smoothing her gray silk blouse with shaking hands. The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking help from someone whose life she had nearly destroyed. She caught her reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the uncertain woman staring back at her. After taking several deep breaths, Margaret stepped out of her car. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the building's entrance, each step feeling heavier than the last. The lobby was sleek and modern with marble floors and abstract art on the walls. It spoke of success, of power, everything Imani had fought to achieve despite the obstacles Margaret had placed in her path. The air conditioning hit her face, making her shiver slightly. The receptionist, Lisa Porter, sat behind a curved desk, her face illuminated by a computer screen. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped steadily on the keyboard, and she didn't look up when Margaret approached, as if she were just another visitor seeking justice. "Do you have an appointment?" Lisa's voice was cool, professional, with an edge that suggested she knew exactly who Margaret was. Margaret cleared her throat, trying to summon her old courtroom authority, but finding it slipping away like sand through her fingers. "I need to speak to Ms. Douglas. It's urgent." Lisa's fingers moved across her keyboard, her expression unchanged. A hint of satisfaction crossed her face. "She's busy." "You don't understand," Margaret insisted, her voice rising slightly. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk. "This is important. I dash." "Ms. Douglas is fully booked," Lisa cut her off, finally looking up with steely eyes. "If you'd like to schedule a consultation, the earliest opening is 3 weeks from now." Margaret clenched her fists, feeling the unfamiliar sting of powerlessness. The weight of her judicial robe, once so comforting, now felt like a ghost on her shoulders. She opened her mouth to argue when the glass doors behind her swished open. Imani Douglas stepped out, a vision in a perfectly tailored navy suit. Her hair was styled in elegant braids, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew their worth. A small diamond pendant gleamed at her throat, success worn like armor. She stopped abruptly when she saw Margaret, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze between them. Then slowly, a knowing smile spread across Imani's face. Her eyes held a mix of triumph and something darker, the weight of their shared history. Years of pain and determination reflected in that single look. "Well, well," Imani said, her voice smooth as silk. "If it isn't Judge Caldwell, to what do I owe the honor?" Margaret stood there, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. The tables had turned completely, and they both knew it. She was no longer the powerful judge on the bench. She was just another desperate grandmother pleading for help. The marble floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as if her whole world was tilting on its axis. Margaret sat rigidly in the leather chair of the waiting area, her fingers drumming against her designer purse, betraying the anxiety she refused to show on her face. Through the glass walls, she watched Imani Douglas shake hands with a well-dressed client, noting how the young woman's confident smile never wavered. The woman who had once stood trembling before her bench now commanded respect in every gesture, from her straight-backed posture to her firm handshake. The office walls displayed Imani's achievements like battle trophies, Harvard Law Diploma, Attorney of the Year plaques, newspaper headlines declaring her victories against seemingly impossible odds. Each one felt like a personal rebuke to Margaret, a stark reminder of how wrong she had been all those years ago. Lisa, the receptionist, barely glanced up from her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Ms. Douglas will see you now," she said coolly, gesturing toward the office door with a dismissive flick of her wrist. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady beneath her expensive suit. She straightened her cream silk blouse, hating how her hands shook and how vulnerable she felt in this sleek modern office. The walk to Imani's office felt endless, each step echoing against the polished hardwood floors. Imani sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her suit was perfectly tailored, her presence commanding the space like she'd been born to it. She gestured to the leather chair across from her. "Please sit." "I never expected to see you walk into my office," Imani said, leaning back in her chair, arms crossed over her chest. Her voice held no warmth, just cool professional detachment. Margaret cleared her throat, fighting down her pride. "I need your help." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, like surrender. "My help?" Imani's perfectly groomed eyebrow arched. A small, knowing smile played at her lips, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret explained Ben's situation, her voice growing desperate with each detail she shared. "He's a good boy. He just made a mistake. The prosecutor won't listen. They're trying to make an example of him." "Actions have consequences," Imani cut in, her words sharp as glass, cutting through Margaret's pleas. "Isn't that what you told me in your courtroom, when I begged you to understand that I was innocent, when I showed you all the evidence?" Margaret's stomach twisted into knots. "This is different, Ben." "Different how?" Imani leaned forward, her dark eyes intense behind her glasses, pinning Margaret to her seat. "Because he's your grandson? Because he comes from a good family? Because he deserves a second chance?" Each question landed like a blow, precise and devastating. "Please," Margaret whispered, hating the tremor in her voice, the weakness she couldn't hide. "I'll pay whatever fee." Imani closed the folder on her desk with a sharp snap that made Margaret flinch. "I don't take every case that walks through my door, Judge Caldwell." She stood, smoothing her charcoal gray skirt with steady hands. "And I certainly don't take cases for people who ruined my life." She gestured to the door, dismissal clear in every line of her body, from her rigid shoulders to her lifted chin. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, truly powerless for the first time in her life, feeling the weight of karma pressing down on her shoulders. Margaret and Elaine sat side by side on cold metal chairs in the jail's visitation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the institutional green walls. Margaret's designer suit felt out of place against the stark surroundings. Elaine's hands trembled as she twisted a tissue between her fingers. The heavy door buzzed open. A guard led Ben in, his wrists bound by metal cuffs that clinked with each step. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, making him look smaller, younger. Elaine let out a soft gasp, pressing the crumpled tissue to her mouth. Margaret's jaw tightened as she took in her grandson's appearance. His usually neat hair was disheveled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He tried to manage a smile as he lowered himself onto the metal chair across from them. "It's fine, Grandma. I'll be out soon," Ben said, his voice carrying a false bravado that made Margaret's heart ache. She stared at him, seeing past his brave front to the scared teenager underneath. He had no idea what he was facing. The door opened again and Tyler Grant hurried in, his tie askew and arms full of messy papers. He dropped several sheets as he approached, scrambling to pick them up. "Sorry I'm late," he muttered, pulling up a chair. "We're trying to push for bail." Margaret turned sharply toward the young lawyer, her eyes flashing. "Trying? Do you even have a plan?" Her voice carried the same authority it had wielded from the bench, but Tyler barely seemed to notice as he shuffled through his disorganized paperwork. "The prosecution is fighting it hard," Tyler explained, not meeting her eyes. "They're saying Ben is a flight risk because of the family's resources." He swallowed hard. They're making an example of him." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. No special treatment, no pulling strings, no power. The system she had upheld for decades was now an immovable force standing against her family. Elaine broke down, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be happening," she sobbed. "He's just a boy. My boy." Ben's confident facade cracked at the sight of his mother's tears. "Mom, please don't cry," he pleaded, trying to reach across the table. The chains restricted his movement, making the gesture even more heartbreaking. The guard stepped forward. "Time's up." "But we just got here," Elaine protested, wiping frantically at her tears. "Rules are rules, ma'am," the guard said firmly, moving to help Ben up. Margaret watched helplessly as her grandson was pulled to his feet. Ben turned back, his eyes wide with fear that he could no longer hide. "You won't let me stay here, will you?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time in her life, she had no answer, no solution, no power to change what was happening. She could only watch in silence as the guard led Ben away, the door closing behind them with a heavy, final thud. The heavy silence hung in the air as the door closed, leaving Margaret and Elaine alone in the stark visitation room. Elaine's sobs echoed off the bare walls, her heart breaking at the sight of her son being taken away. Margaret sat beside her, her usually stern expression softened by the weight of the moment. After a long moment, Elaine turned to her mother, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading. "We have to do something, Mother. We can't just let them keep him there." Her voice trembled, the desperation evident in every word. Margaret sighed heavily, the burden of her past decisions bearing down on her. "I'm afraid we may not have the power to change this, Elaine," she said, her voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. "The system I upheld for so long is now working against us." She shook her head slowly, the realization of her own role in this situation dawning on her. Elaine's brow furrowed in frustration. "But you're Margaret Caldwell. You were a judge for decades. Surely you can pull some strings, use your influence to get him out of there." Her hands clenched into fists, the tissue crumpling in her grasp. Margaret reached out, placing a gentle hand on Elaine's arm. "I wish it were that simple, my dear. But the truth is, I no longer have that kind of power. The very system I helped build is now working against our family." Her eyes met Elaine's, filled with a rare admission of fallibility. Elaine's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from her. "Then what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "We can't just leave him there." Margaret's expression hardened with determination. "We will find a way, Elaine. I may not have the influence I once did, but I refuse to give up on your son." Her hand tightened its grip, a silent promise of support. "We will do whatever it takes to bring him home." Elaine nodded, drawing strength from her mother's unwavering resolve. Together, they would navigate this uncharted territory, driven by a fierce love and a determination to right the wrongs of the past. Margaret slipped into the back row of courtroom 3A, her heart pounding against her ribs. The familiar smell of polished wood and leather brought back memories, but this time, she wasn't the one wielding power from behind the bench. She crossed her arms, trying to look casual, as if she just happened to be here, though her trembling hands betrayed her nervousness. Judge Cynthia Reynolds sat where Margaret once did, her expression neutral as she reviewed the documents before her. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension until the doors opened and Imani Douglas strode in. Margaret's breath caught. Imani moved with purpose, her navy suit perfectly tailored, her head held high. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she could do. Her heels clicked decisively against the floor as she made her way to the defense table. "Your Honor," Imani began, her voice clear and strong, carrying the weight of conviction. "The state imprisoned Marcus Williams for 8 years based on fabricated evidence and a coerced confession. 8 years of an innocent man's life stolen." Prosecutor Leonard Price jumped to his feet, his face flushed. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making unfounded accusations." "I have the proof right here," Imani countered, holding up a thick folder, her fingers steady and sure. "Phone records that were conveniently lost during the original trial, witness statements that were buried, and DNA evidence that proves my client couldn't have committed this crime. The truth has been hidden for far too long." Margaret leaned forward, watching as Imani methodically dismantled the prosecution's case. This wasn't the trembling teenager who had stood before her years ago. This was a force of nature, every word calculated, every argument precise. "The system," Imani continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, passion burning in her eyes, "failed Marcus Williams. It stole 8 years of his life. His daughter grew up without a father. His mother died while he sat in a cell. And why? Because nobody bothered to look deeper. Nobody cared enough to question the convenient narrative. The truth was there all along, buried under layers of prejudice and negligence." Price shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Imani presented document after document, testimony after testimony. His confidence seemed to deflate with each new piece of evidence. Judge Reynolds studied each piece carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Your Honor?" Imani's voice grew even more passionate, her words ringing with truth. "You have a choice today. You can uphold an injustice simply because it's easier, or you can do what's right. Marcus Williams isn't asking for revenge, he's asking for justice, the justice he should have received 8 years ago. The justice this court is sworn to provide." Margaret sat perfectly still, her throat tight. She remembered how she used to view cases like this, cut and dry, black and white, but watching Imani fight with such fierce determination made her see everything differently. Each word struck her like an arrow, reminding her of her own role in perpetuating injustice. Judge Reynolds took off her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented by Ms. Douglas, this court finds that Marcus Williams was wrongfully convicted. Mr. Williams, you are hereby released with the state's deepest apologies. The court extends its gratitude to Ms. Douglas for her diligent work in bringing this injustice to light." The courtroom erupted in muffled cheers. Marcus Williams, a tall man with graying temples and eyes full of unshed tears, broke down as his family rushed to embrace him. His daughter, now a teenager, clung to him as if afraid he might disappear again. Margaret remained frozen in her seat, watching as Imani packed up her briefcase, accepting congratulations from colleagues with quiet dignity. This wasn't the same person who had stood trembling in Margaret's courtroom all those years ago. This was someone who had taken her pain and forged it into purpose, her anger into action, becoming a beacon of hope for others trapped in the system's shadows. And Margaret needed her help, needed this version of Imani who fought like a warrior for justice. But watching her now, seeing the power and purpose in every movement, Margaret wondered if she deserved it, if she had any right to ask for help from someone whose life she had so profoundly damaged. Margaret sat rigidly in the plush leather chair across from Imani's desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. The office felt different in the evening light, somehow more intimidating, more accusatory. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights twinkled like distant stars, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors and highlighting the prestigious law firm's awards that lined the walls. Imani's lips curved into a slight smile as she settled into her chair, adjusting her gold pen on the desk with precise movements. "You came back." The words hung in the air between them, making Margaret's chest tighten with each passing second. She hated feeling this vulnerable, this powerless, especially in front of someone whose life she had once controlled with a simple bang of her gavel. I did, Margaret managed, her voice smaller than she'd like, betraying years of carefully cultivated authority. She reached into her worn leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, worn at the edges from hours of desperate research and sleepless nights. I found something, Margaret said, sliding the file across Imani's pristine desk. A legal loophole in Ben's case. It could help. Her fingers lingered on the folder for a moment before letting go, as if surrendering her last piece of dignity. Imani picked up the file with deliberate slowness, flipping it open with the practiced ease of someone who had reviewed thousands of cases. Her dark eyes scanned the contents, expression unreadable, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After what felt like an eternity, she looked back up at Margaret. "And why should I help you?" Imani's voice was cool, professional, razor-sharp, the kind of tone Margaret herself had used countless times from the bench, though it felt different being on the receiving end. Margaret exhaled sharply, fighting to keep her composure as her perfectly maintained facade began to crack. "Because you care about justice. I've seen you in court. I watched how passionately you fought for that young man yesterday. The way you stood up to the prosecution, it was remarkable." A low chuckle escaped Imani's lips, but there was no warmth in it, only years of buried pain rising to the surface. Justice? She closed the file with a snap that made Margaret flinch. Where was that belief in justice when I was the one begging for it? When my mother was crying in your courtroom? When my entire future was being stripped away because you couldn't see past your own prejudices? The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. Her mouth opened, then closed, her carefully prepared arguments crumbling to dust. No response came. What could she possibly say to that? Imani stood, her navy suit perfectly pressed, her presence filling the room like a gathering storm. She picked up the file and tossed it back across the desk. It landed with a soft thud in front of Margaret, a reminder of her newfound powerlessness. "You don't get to play savior now," Imani said, walking toward the door. Her heels clicked against the floor, each step echoing in Margaret's ears like a judge's gavel pronouncing sentence. Margaret remained seated, staring at the rejected file, feeling the weight of every wrongful conviction she'd ever handed down. Time was running out for Ben, and with it, her last hopes of helping him. The weight of helplessness pressed down on her shoulders, a feeling she'd inflicted on countless others without a second thought, never imagining she'd one day experience it herself. Through the glass walls, she could see Lisa at her desk, watching with barely concealed satisfaction as Imani walked away. Margaret was alone now, truly alone, with nothing but the consequences of her past actions for company and the bitter taste of karmic justice in her mouth. The courthouse hadn't changed in the decades Margaret had presided there, but sitting on these hard wooden benches felt entirely different. The familiar smell of polished wood and old papers now made her stomach churn. Even the afternoon sunlight filtering through the tall windows seemed harsher, more accusatory. Beside her, Elaine's fingers dug into her palm, trembling. "They'll let him out, right? He's a good kid," Elaine whispered, her voice cracking. "He's never been in trouble before." Margaret couldn't bring herself to respond. She knew better now. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom, making several spectators jump. The Honorable Judge Richard Matthews presiding. Margaret's former colleague swept into the courtroom, his black robes billowing. His face was a mask of stern authority she knew all too well. He didn't even glance her way, though she could feel the weight of others' stares. The message was clear, her status meant nothing here. David Whitman strode in, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, that familiar smug smile playing at his lips. His confidence filled the room like a suffocating cloud. On their side, Tyler Grant shuffled through a mess of papers, his tie slightly askew and his forehead already beading with sweat. Margaret's heart sank. "Your Honor," Whitman began, his voice smooth as oil. "The state strongly opposes bail in this case." He paused for effect, his practiced, theatrical timing making Margaret's skin crawl. "The defendant comes from a family with significant resources. His grandmother is retired Judge Margaret Caldwell." Elaine's grip tightened painfully on Margaret's hand, her nails leaving crescent marks in her mother's skin. "Furthermore," Whitman continued, standing straighter, "with an absent father and these connections, Mr. Caldwell presents a serious flight risk. The quantity of drugs found in his possession indicates this wasn't some youthful indiscretion but a calculated criminal enterprise. Objection! Tyler Grant stumbled to his feet, dropping several papers that scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. That's speculation, Your Honor. His voice wavered uncertainly. Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow, his expression eerily familiar to Margaret. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Whitman. Ben sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched in his orange jumpsuit that seemed 2 sizes too big. Margaret watched as the reality of his situation finally hit him. The trembling hands, the pallor of his skin, the fear in his eyes as he glanced back at his mother and grandmother. He looked so young, so vulnerable. Tyler Grant's defense was painful to watch. He stammered through character references, mentioned Ben's clean record, his college plans, his volunteer work at the local shelter. But it all felt hollow against Whitman's polished prosecution. Each stumbling word seemed to dig their grandson's grave deeper. Given the severity of the charges and the flight risk Mr. Whitman has outlined, Judge Matthews declared, his tone carrying that note of finality Margaret had used countless times herself. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody until trial. The gavel crashed down with devastating finality, the sound echoing off the wooden walls like a gunshot. "No!" Elaine's cry echoed through the courtroom, raw with desperation. "Please, you can't. He's just a boy." Ben's face went ash-white as the bailiff approached with handcuffs, his eyes locked with Margaret's, silently pleading for help. The same look she'd seen countless times from other defendants' families, the look she'd always managed to ignore before. But now she was powerless to do anything but watch as they led her grandson away, the chains around his wrists jingling with each step. Margaret sat frozen, her world crumbling around her. For the first time, she truly understood what it felt like to be on the other side of justice, to watch helplessly as the system she'd served for so long turned its cold face toward someone she loved. The realization settled in her chest like a block of ice, heavy with the weight of all the families she'd dismissed over the years. The crystal tumbler shook in Margaret's weathered hand as she poured herself another generous helping of bourbon. The house, once filled with the warmth of family, now felt hauntingly empty and cold. Her eyes drifted to the family photos adorning the walls, each one a bittersweet reminder of happier times, especially the snapshot of Ben's high school graduation, his bright smile and boundless potential, now cruelly tarnished by the harsh realities of the justice system he had once trusted. Suddenly, the front door burst open and Elaine, Margaret's daughter, rushed in, her face streaked with tears and mascara, eyes wild with anguish and fury. "This is your fault!" The words erupted from Elaine's trembling lips like a thunderclap. Margaret set down her glass, stunned into silence by the raw emotion radiating from her daughter. Don't you dare try to explain this away," Elaine cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "Do you know what Ben told me today? The other inmates already know who he is, the tough judge's grandson. They're making his life hell in there." Margaret's throat tightened with a mixture of guilt and dread. "We'll figure something out," she began, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Like what?" Elaine laughed bitterly, pacing the room, her hands shaking with pent-up frustration. "Pull strings? Call in favors? Isn't that exactly what you condemned other families for trying to do?" She paused, her eyes burning with accusation. "All those years, Mom. All those young black men you sent away. You built this system. You made it what it is. And now Ben is just another statistic." "I followed the law," Margaret protested weakly, grasping at the remnants of her once unwavering conviction. "I was fair." "Fair?" Elaine whirled on her, eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "Was it fair when you gave that honor student, what was her name, Imani, 5 years for being in the wrong car at the wrong time? Was it fair when you denied every appeal from every mother who begged you for mercy?" Margaret felt the weight of those words as she sank into her leather chair, the same chair she had occupied countless times, reviewing cases and feeling secure in her decisions. But now, the comfort of that familiar seat offered no solace, only a haunting reminder of the lives she had so callously disregarded. "I don't care how many years you sat on that bench," Elaine's voice dropped to a whisper, laced with a pain that cut Margaret to the core. "You were wrong." The words hung in the air like a poisonous fog, and Elaine turned and stormed out, leaving Margaret alone in the dimming light. With trembling fingers, Margaret pulled an old case file from her desk, Imani Douglas versus the state, and her own neat handwriting stared back at her. The words "no remorse shown," "another drug case," and "make an example" now searing into her conscience like a brand. As tears blurred her vision, Margaret Caldwell, for the first time in her career, saw the truth she had so long refused to acknowledge. She had not been delivering justice at all. She had been destroying lives one gavel strike at a time. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the courthouse steps as Margaret stepped up to the podium. Her hands trembled visibly as she gripped its edges, facing a restless sea of reporters and flashing cameras. Sweat beaded at her temples despite the crisp fall air. Jenna Ross stood prominently in the front row, recorder raised high, her eyes sharp and questioning, ready to pounce on every word. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, her voice wavering slightly. She glanced down at her prepared statement, then deliberately set it aside with shaking fingers. No more hiding behind carefully crafted words. Not today. 10 years ago, I wrongfully sentenced Imani Douglas. The words hung in the air like thick smoke, heavy with decades of denial. Cameras clicked rapidly in the sudden silence. I ignored evidence. I dismissed her pleas. I destroyed her future. Each admission felt like a knife twisting in her gut. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Elaine stood at the back, arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching her mother with a complex mix of pride and pain. Her fingers dug into her arms as she witnessed this public unraveling. "Judge Caldwell," Jenna Ross's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Are you saying you were racially biased in your rulings?" Margaret's throat went bone dry. She thought of all the times she'd denied it, all the times she'd hidden behind procedure and precedent like a shield. "Yes," she said simply. The word felt like shards of glass in her mouth, cutting as it came out. The courthouse steps erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions over each other in a deafening roar. Phones lit up like fireflies as social media exploded with the news. Local stations scrambled to cut their regular programming to broadcast live, their van operators frantically adjusting satellite dishes. "How many other cases were affected by this bias?" someone shouted from the back. "What about the other defendants you sentenced? Is this related to your grandson's arrest?" Margaret stood steady as granite, accepting each question like a physical blow. She deserved this. She had earned this moment of public reckoning, this dismantling of her carefully constructed facade. In her downtown office, Imani Douglas watched the live stream on her computer screen, her expression carved from stone. Her fingers drummed slowly, methodically on her polished desk as Margaret continued her confession. Behind her, framed newspaper clippings documented her remarkable rise from wrongfully convicted teenager to celebrated attorney, each headline a step in her journey. Margaret's voice cracked like thin ice as she continued. "I cannot undo the damage I've done. I cannot give Imani Douglas back the years I stole from her. But I can admit my wrongs. I can face what I've done." Each word seemed to age her, stripping away her judicial armor. The crowd grew louder, more insistent. Social media notifications pinged rapidly on phones throughout the crowd like digital crickets. Judge Caldwell confessions started trending, spreading like wildfire across platforms. Imani leaned back in her leather chair, watching Margaret crumble on screen. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply reached for her phone with practiced composure, picking it up with deliberate slowness. The weight of the moment settled around her like a familiar cloak. Margaret finished her statement, stepping back from the podium as questions continued to fly like arrows. She had done it. She had finally spoken the truth that had haunted her for years. Whether it would help Ben, whether it would make any difference at all in the grand scheme of things, she didn't know. But for the first time in her long career, she had chosen truth over pride, vulnerability over power. Lisa Porter burst into Imani's office, her normally composed demeanor cracking with excitement. Her phone was clutched tightly in her hand, screen still displaying the live newsfeed, its glow reflecting off her wide eyes. "Miss Douglas, you're not going to believe this," Lisa said breathlessly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Margaret Caldwell just confessed, on live TV. She admitted everything about your case. Every single detail you've been fighting to prove for years. Imani sat behind her desk, perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. Her face remained neutral as she watched the footage playing silently on her computer screen. Margaret stood at the podium, looking smaller than Imani had ever seen her, her once proud shoulders hunched beneath the weight of her confession. "She's begging for your help," Lisa added, studying her boss's reaction with concern in her eyes. "Says she needs the best defense attorney in the state." Imani's fingers traced the edge of a case file on her desk, following the worn corners that had been thumbed through countless times. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Lisa shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, waiting for a response. "Are you going to take the case?" Lisa finally asked, her voice gentle but probing. Imani stared at her desk, lost in thought, memories of her own trial flooding back. Her gut reaction was an immediate no. Why should she help the woman who had destroyed her future? But something tugged at her conscience, a feeling she couldn't quite shake, an echo of the person she'd been before prison had hardened her. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. A text message appeared from an unknown number. "You were right. Actions have consequences. I need your help. Please." The desperation in those simple words was palpable. Lisa peered at the message, biting her lower lip. "She's desperate," she observed quietly. "Never thought I'd see the day." Imani exhaled slowly, pushing back her chair and standing. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, each motion carefully measured. She had waited years for this moment, to see Margaret Caldwell brought low, begging for mercy. But victory felt different than she'd imagined, hollow somehow, like a bell without its clapper. "Call her," Imani said finally, her voice steady. "Tell her I'll see her tomorrow." Across town, Margaret sat alone in her living room, surrounded by shadows. The lights were dim, and the TV was muted, though her face still flickered across every news channel, a constant reminder of her public fall from grace. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at her phone, waiting, each minute stretching into an eternity. When it finally rang, her heart jumped painfully in her chest. The screen displayed, "Incoming call, Douglas and Associates," the words burning into her vision. Margaret drew in a shaky breath, trying to steady herself to find some remnant of her former authority. She pressed the answer button with trembling fingers. "Margaret Caldwell speaking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, all pretense of power gone. There was a pause on the other end, long enough to make her wonder if anyone was there, long enough for her stomach to twist with anxiety. Then Imani's voice came through, cold and sharp as steel, cutting through the silence like a blade. "We need to talk." The marble halls of the courthouse echoed with Imani's confident footsteps. Her navy suit was crisp, her shoulders straight, her expression carved from stone. A silver pendant, her mother's, hung at her throat, catching the morning light. This building had once witnessed her darkest day. Now it would see her triumph. Whispers followed her path, growing louder with each step she took. "That's Imani Douglas, the lawyer who was wrongfully convicted. Did you see Margaret Caldwell's confession? Can you believe she came back to practice law here?" In the back row of the courtroom, Margaret sat quietly, her hands twisted in her lap, her once pristine judicial robe replaced by a simple gray dress. She looked smaller now, older, the weight of guilt visible in the slump of her shoulders and the new lines around her mouth. This wasn't her domain anymore. She was just another observer, watching the wheels of justice turn without her guidance. Judge Helen Monroe entered, her black robe swishing as she took her seat. The sound of shuffling papers and murmured conversations died instantly. The bailiff's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "All rise. The Court of Appeals is now in session, the Honorable Judge Monroe presiding." Prosecutor Leonard Price stood first, his argument rehearsed and mechanical, his tie slightly crooked. "Your Honor, this conviction has already been thoroughly reviewed. Ms. Douglas served her sentence. The evidence?" "The evidence," Imani cut in, rising slowly from her chair with the grace of someone who knew exactly what was at stake, was circumstantial at best and prejudiced at worst. Her voice carried the weight of personal truth, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "I was a 17-year-old honor student with a full ride to Harvard. I had no prior record, no motive, and no connection to the drugs found in that car. My only crime was being in the wrong neighborhood. Margaret watched from her seat, each word hitting like a physical blow, her fingers gripping the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white. This was what real advocacy looked like. This was what she had ignored all those years ago, too wrapped up in her own prejudices to see the truth. Jenna Ross's pen scratched rapidly across her notepad, her press badge swinging with each movement. The story of the decade was unfolding, and she wasn't missing a detail, not even the slight tremor in Imani's otherwise steady hands. The system, Imani continued, her voice steady and clear as a bell, saw what it wanted to see. A young black girl in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was enough for a conviction. That was enough to destroy my future. She paused, letting the words sink in, her gaze sweeping across the packed courtroom. But today, you have the power to acknowledge that mistake, to show that justice isn't just a word we throw around in these halls. It's a promise we make to every citizen who walks through these doors. Judge Monroe studied Imani carefully, her expression thoughtful, fingers steepled beneath her chin. The courtroom held its breath, the tension palpable in the air. After reviewing the new evidence, Judge Monroe began, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room, her words measured and deliberate, and examining the clear flaws in the initial trial, I am overturning Imani Douglas's conviction. The gasp was collective, rippling through the gathered crowd like a wave. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, hot and unexpected, a single drop rolling down her weathered cheek. Imani stood perfectly still, letting out a long, slow breath, her hand unconsciously touching the pendant at her throat. After 15 years, she was finally, officially, innocent. The truth she had known all along was at last acknowledged by the very system that had once condemned her. In Imani's sleek office, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her mahogany desk. Jenna Ross, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, strode in with purpose, clutching a thick manila folder. "I've been digging," Jenna said, dropping the folder onto Imani's desk with a heavy thud. "And what I found, it's worse than we thought." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair while Imani reached for the folder with steady hands. As she opened it, documents spilled out. Case files, court records, evidence logs. "Look at the pattern," Jenna pointed to a spreadsheet. "Over the past 15 years, there's been a dramatic spike in convictions of young black defendants, most with minimal evidence, maximum sentences." Imani's eyes scanned the pages, her expression hardening. "These names," she murmured, running her finger down the list. Margaret leaned forward, her face paling as she recognized case after case that had come through her courtroom. "I presided over at least 30 of these. And look who prosecuted almost every single one," Jenna said, pulling out another document. "David Whitman." Imani's voice was ice cold. Jenna nodded. "He built his career on these convictions. But here's where it gets ugly." She pulled out more papers, bank statements, redacted emails, phone records. "He wasn't just aggressive, he was manufacturing evidence." Margaret's hands began to shake. "What are you saying?" "Paid informants, planted drugs, corrupted evidence logs." Jenna's voice was grim. "Your grandson, Ben? He's just the latest target in a long line of frame-ups." Imani slammed the file shut, her jaw clenched tight. The sound echoed through the office like a gunshot. "This isn't just about Ben anymore," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "This is about all of them." Margaret sank back in her chair, the weight of realization crushing her. "I defended this system," she whispered. "I believed in it." Imani picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. "Well, now you know what it really is." She pressed a button, waiting as it rang. "Get me the team," she commanded. "We're going after Whitman." Margaret closed her eyes, the truth finally settling in her bones. She hadn't just been strict. She'd been a willing participant in a rigged game. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as reporters jostled for position. Camera flashes lit up the gray morning like lightning strikes. Imani Douglas stood at the podium, her navy suit crisp and professional, her expression determined. "For years, innocent people were sent to prison because of corruption in this system," she declared, her voice carrying across the crowd. Today, we fight back. Margaret Caldwell stood at the back of the steps, her hands clasped tightly together. She watched as Imani commanded the attention of every person present. This should have been her moment to apologize, to make things right, but she knew better now. This wasn't her story to tell. Within hours, the investigation into David Whitman exploded across every news channel. Jenna Ross's exclusive report aired during prime time, revealing damning evidence of fabricated testimonies, buried evidence, and racial targeting. Sources confirm that Prosecutor Whitman systematically targeted young black defendants, Jenna reported, her voice steady. Multiple cases are now under review. Whitman's initial response was predictable. "These accusations are baseless," he told reporters outside his office. "My record speaks for itself." But his confident smile didn't quite reach his eyes. When Margaret received the subpoena to testify, her hands shook as she opened the envelope. Decades of working alongside Whitman flashed through her mind, the knowing looks, the unspoken agreements, the willful blindness. The courtroom fell silent as Margaret took the stand. She could feel Whitman's cold stare, but she didn't look his way. Instead, she focused on Imani, who sat watching with unwavering attention. "I ignored what I should have questioned," Margaret testified, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I upheld what I should have challenged. I was wrong." Her testimony made headlines nationwide. "Former judge admits to systemic racism in court system," and "Retired judge's testimony exposes decades of corruption." The evidence mounted. More witnesses came forward. Finally, the district attorney announced formal charges against David Whitman, multiple counts of prosecutorial misconduct spanning his entire career. Imani stood in the back of the courtroom as Whitman was formally charged, watching his shoulders slump as the reality of his situation sank in. For the first time since her own wrongful conviction, she felt the sweet taste of true justice. The once powerful prosecutor was led away in handcuffs, his career and reputation in ruins. No special treatment, no backdoor deals, just the system working the way it should have all along. The packed courtroom hummed with tension as Judge Reynolds took her seat. Camera crews lined the back wall, their lenses focused on the unfolding drama. Ben Caldwell sat rigid at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to Imani's polished appearance beside him. Margaret watched from the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the weight of her powerlessness pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't her courtroom anymore. She was just another spectator now. Imani rose gracefully, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed." Prosecutor Mark Hastings shuffled his papers, already looking defeated. The case had been built on Whitman's corruption, and everyone knew it. As the trial unfolded, Imani methodically dismantled the prosecution's case. Her voice rang clear and confident through the courtroom. The search was illegal. The evidence chain was compromised. The witness statements are inconsistent. With each point, Hastings seemed to shrink further into his chair. The jury watched intently as Imani held up document after document, exposing the holes in the case. "There is no solid evidence," Imani declared, her words cutting through the air. "No reason for this case to have ever existed." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched Ben. He sat straighter now, hope beginning to shine through his fear. This was what justice should look like. This was what she should have fought for all along. Imani's closing argument landed like thunder. If justice is real, if fairness exists in this courtroom, then you must do the only right thing. You must let Ben go. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they filed back in, their faces told the story before the verdict was read. Judge Reynolds adjusted her glasses. "On the charge of felony drug possession, we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Ben collapsed forward, shoulders shaking with relief. Elaine rushed to embrace her son, sobbing openly. Margaret sat still, letting out a long breath as tears rolled down her cheeks. She watched as Imani calmly packed her files, professional to the last moment. Justice had finally been served, not through power or prejudice, but through truth and determination. The very system Margaret had once wielded like a weapon had been turned toward real justice. And for the first time in her career, she was grateful to have lost control of it. The jury foreman rose slowly, clutching a small piece of paper. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft whir of camera equipment at the back. Ben's knuckles turned white as he gripped the defense table, his shoulders tense beneath the orange jumpsuit. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingers had gone numb. She could feel Elaine trembling beside her, could hear her daughter's shallow breathing. Judge Reynolds adjusted her glasses, her face impassive. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, voice steady. The paper rustled as he unfolded it. Ben closed his eyes. Elaine reached for Margaret's hand. "On the charge of felony drug possession." The foreman paused and the silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. "We find the defendant not guilty." A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Elaine's sob broke free, raw and relieved as she clutched Margaret's arm. Ben's shoulders slumped forward, his whole body sagging with release as he exhaled shakily. Tears streamed down his face. Imani remained composed, gathering her papers with precise movements. Her face showed no celebration, just a simple nod of acknowledgement. She had expected nothing less. Judge Reynolds brought down her gavel. "The defendant is hereby cleared of all charges. Case dismissed." The sound echoed through the courtroom like a final punctuation mark. The prosecution team packed up quickly, shoving papers into briefcases, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Their hasty retreat spoke volumes about their embarrassment. As the bailiff approached to remove his handcuffs, Ben turned to Imani. His voice was quiet, thick with emotion. "Thank you." Imani met his gaze directly, her expression serious. "Don't waste your second chance." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the floor. Margaret watched her go, feeling the weight of everything. Her past decisions, her privilege, her blindness, settling heavily on her shoulders. She knew this victory, while sweet, was just one small step toward real justice. The downtown conference hall buzzed with anticipation. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of attorneys, activists, and journalists, packed shoulder to shoulder. At the podium, Imani Douglas stood tall, her navy suit crisp, her presence commanding. The microphone caught her steady breath before she began. Margaret Caldwell slipped into the back row, keeping her head down. No one noticed the former judge. They were all focused on Imani. The contrast wasn't lost on Margaret. Once, she had commanded rooms like this. Now she was just another face in the crowd. What happened to Ben Caldwell wasn't an isolated incident. Imani's voice rang clear through the speakers. It wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was business as usual in a system designed to fail certain people while protecting others. Phones lit up across the room as Jenna Ross rapid-fired tweets. Margaret could see the journalist's fingers flying across her screen. Douglas calls for complete overhaul of judicial system. Pattern of targeted prosecution must end. Imani held up a thick folder. "I have here documented cases spanning 20 years. Young black defendants. Fabricated evidence. Rushed trials. Harsh sentences." Her eyes swept the room. "How many more lives need to be destroyed before we admit the truth?" Heads nodded throughout the audience. A young public defender wiped tears from her eyes. 2 rows ahead of Margaret, a group of civil rights attorneys whispered and made notes. "We need independent oversight of prosecutorial conduct," Imani continued. "We need to eliminate mandatory minimums that target specific communities. We need judges who understand their own biases." Margaret's chest tightened. She saw faces in the crowd, mothers who reminded her of Lillian Douglas, young men who could have been Imani years ago. Each one represented a life she might have impacted from her bench, decisions made with what she now recognized as casual cruelty. "The time for incremental change is over." Imani's voice grew stronger. "We need to tear down this broken system and build something that actually delivers justice. Real justice. Equal justice." The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous standing ovation. People rose to their feet, cheering. Margaret remained seated, hands folded in her lap. She watched as Imani stepped away from the podium, immediately surrounded by supporters and fellow attorneys. This was Imani's world now. The old guard, Margaret's generation, was fading. Their harsh sentences, their tough-on-crime mentality, their blind spots and biases, all of it was being swept away. Margaret sat alone as the crowd surged forward, knowing her time had passed. The evening sun cast long shadows through the glass-walled law office as Margaret Caldwell stood before the receptionist's desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her blazer, a nervous habit from decades on the bench. Lisa Porter glanced up, her expression cool and professional. "I need to see Ms. Douglas," Margaret said, her voice softer than it had ever been in her courtroom. Lisa tapped her keyboard without looking up. "She's busy with case preparations. I'll wait." Margaret settled into one of the sleek leather chairs in the waiting area. Minutes stretched into hours. She watched staff members hurry past, their shoes clicking against the polished floors. Some gave her curious glances. They recognized the former judge who'd made headlines with her public confession. Finally, Lisa's phone buzzed. She nodded toward Imani's office. "Ms. Douglas will see you now." Margaret rose slowly, her joints stiff from waiting. The walk to Imani's office felt longer than any courtroom approach. Through the glass walls, she could see Imani at her desk, reviewing documents with laser focus. The office was warm, but Margaret felt a chill as she sat in the visitor's chair. No drinks were offered, no pleasantries exchanged. The silence stretched between them like a canyon. "I never thought I'd be sitting here like this," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Imani leaned back in her chair, face unreadable. "And yet, here you are." Margaret drew in a deep breath. The words she'd rehearsed 100 times felt inadequate now. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I had to say it. I'm sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. Imani studied Margaret with the same intensity she used to dissect legal arguments. Her dark eyes held no warmth, no comfort. "You don't get to be sorry," Imani finally said, her words precise and cutting. "Not after what you did." Margaret nodded, accepting the weight of those words. Her shoulders slumped slightly. Imani leaned forward, her voice gaining edge. "You think guilt changes anything? It doesn't undo the years I lost. It doesn't fix the system you upheld." "I know," Margaret whispered, looking away from Imani's steady gaze. Imani stood, a clear dismissal. Margaret rose slowly, pausing at the door to look back one final time. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, but perhaps acknowledgement. A slight nod from Imani was all she received. Margaret walked out into the night alone, the weight of her past still heavy on her shoulders. Margaret sat alone in her dimly lit living room, the evening news flickering across her face. The TV anchor's voice was crisp and professional as she introduced the segment. "Tonight, we examine the fall of former Judge Margaret Caldwell." A panel of legal experts appeared on screen. Professor James Chen from Harvard Law spoke first. "What we're seeing is the complete dismantling of a judicial legacy. Judge Caldwell wasn't just tough. She was emblematic of a system that targeted minorities." Margaret's fingers tightened around her wine glass as another analyst chimed in. Her confession has opened the floodgates. Hundreds of her past cases are now under review. "The question remains," a third expert added. "How many lives did she destroy before her own grandson's case forced her to face the truth?" Margaret clicked off the TV, plunging the room into silence. Her hand shook as she reached for the stack of mail on her coffee table. The first envelope bore her law school's letterhead. She already knew what it would say, but she opened it anyway. "Dear Judge Caldwell," she read aloud to the empty room. "In light of recent events, the Board of Trustees has voted unanimously to remove your name from our Hall of Honor. Your actions do not reflect the values we strive to instill in our students." She let the letter fall to her lap. Her phone showed no new messages, the third day in a row. Judge Henry Lawson, her mentor of 30 years, hadn't returned her calls. The country club had quietly suggested she take a break from her membership. More letters waited. One was filled with rage. "You ruined my son's life. Your apology means nothing." Another expressed gratitude. "Thank you for finally telling the truth. Maybe now people will believe what happened to me." Margaret stood, walking to her office where photographs lined the walls. There she was, stern and proud in her black robe, receiving awards, speaking at conferences. Her finger traced the glass of one frame, her first day on the bench. She'd felt so powerful then, so certain of her righteousness. Now that woman in the photos seemed like a stranger. With trembling hands, Margaret turned the frame face down on her desk. The sound of glass against wood echoed in the empty house. She'd spent decades wielding power like a weapon, never imagining she'd find herself on the other side. Now she understood what true powerlessness felt like. No one feared her anymore. No one respected her. No one even wanted to hear her voice. She was just another disgraced figure watching her legacy crumble into dust. Imani sat at her polished mahogany desk, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office. The view of downtown stretched before her, a reminder of how far she'd come. Lisa Porter bustled in, her arms laden with papers and a determined look on her face. "Your schedule is getting crazy," Lisa said, dropping the stack onto Imani's desk. "CNN wants an interview. The New York Times is doing a profile, and..." She paused for effect. "Harvard Law School wants you to give their keynote address this year." Imani's hand froze over her coffee cup. "Harvard? Full circle, isn't it?" Lisa's smile was knowing. "The school you never got to attend now wants you as their featured speaker." Imani leaned back in her chair, taking it in. Her phone buzzed with another notification. Jenna Ross's latest article had just gone live. The headline read, "Imani Douglas, Reshaping American Justice." The article was everywhere within hours. Social media exploded with shares and comments. People called her office, seeking help with their cases. Young law students wrote emails, calling her their inspiration. Ben Caldwell showed up unannounced that afternoon. He stood awkwardly in her doorway, hands in his pockets. "I wanted to say thanks. Again." He paused. "But also, I don't know what to do now. Everything's different." Imani studied him. The privilege he'd once taken for granted was gone, replaced by something more valuable: understanding. "Don't waste this," she told him firmly. "Do something with it." Lisa returned later with more correspondence. "The National Legal Reform Summit wants you as their keynote speaker." She handed over an elegant invitation. Imani opened it, scanning the details. Her eyes caught on a familiar name in the attendee list: Margaret Caldwell. She stared at it for a moment, then set the invitation aside. That was the past. She had bigger things to focus on now. "Tell them yes," she said to Lisa, "and clear my schedule for the Harvard speech. I have some things to say." The grand ballroom of the downtown Marriott sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras at the ready. The air hummed with anticipation. This wasn't just another legal summit. This was Imani Douglas's moment. When Imani entered through the main doors, heads turned. She wore a tailored navy suit, her natural hair styled elegantly, radiating quiet confidence. Cameras flashed. Reporters called out questions. She smiled graciously but kept walking. Through a side door, Margaret Caldwell slipped in quietly. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, but her shoulders hunched slightly, making her seem smaller than before. A few people noticed her. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that Judge Caldwell? I can't believe she showed up." The nerve of her being here. Margaret kept her head down, finding an empty seat near the back. She'd attended hundreds of these events before, always at the front, always surrounded by admirers. Now she sat alone, feeling every disapproving glance. Elaine stood near the refreshment table, chatting with other attendees. When she spotted her mother, her smile faltered. Her shoulders tensed. She turned away, pretending not to see her. A young reporter approached Margaret, notebook in hand. "Judge Caldwell, do you regret your rulings?" The question hung in the air, heavy with years of injustice. Margaret looked up, meeting his eyes. "Yes." Her voice was quiet but firm. Then she stood and walked away, leaving the reporter staring after her. The summit continued. Speakers took the stage, discussing reform and progress. Margaret sat silently, watching. She recognized faces, colleagues who once sought her approval, now avoiding her gaze. She was a ghost in a world she used to rule. When Imani made her way to the stage, the room fell silent. She passed close to Margaret's seat. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Imani's expression remained neutral, professional. She didn't pause, didn't acknowledge Margaret beyond that fleeting glance. She kept walking, head high, toward her rightful place at the podium. Margaret felt the sting of that silent dismissal, but she didn't look away. She knew she deserved it. This was the price of awakening to the truth, watching your old world slip away, knowing you helped build something that needed to be torn down. Imani Douglas took measured steps toward the podium, her heels clicking against the hardwood stage. The spotlight caught her face, highlighting the quiet determination in her eyes. The room fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned expectantly toward her. In the back row, Margaret Caldwell sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. From this distance, Imani was just a silhouette against the bright lights, but her voice carried clearly through the speakers. Justice. Imani let the word hang in the air. We use that word so often in our profession. But what does it really mean? She paused, scanning the crowd. For too long, justice has been wielded like a weapon by those in power. It's been twisted, distorted, used to maintain a system that was never meant to serve everyone equally. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several older judges and lawyers exchanged glances, but the law students leaned forward, hanging on every word. I stand before you today because I refuse to let that system define me, Imani continued, her voice growing stronger. I lost years of my life. My dreams were put on hold. My future was nearly stolen, all in the name of law and order. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. Each word hit like a physical blow. But this isn't about one case or one person, Imani said. This is about hundreds of lives destroyed, families torn apart, communities devastated, all because we accepted a broken system as normal. She held up a thick manila folder. In my hand, I hold 20 cases, 20 lives altered forever by wrongful convictions, 20 stories that demand to be heard. Her voice carried an edge of steel. And these are just from the past month. The room was completely silent now. Margaret could feel tears pricking at her eyes, but she didn't move to wipe them away. Change isn't optional anymore, Imani declared. It's necessary, it's urgent, and it starts with every person in this room acknowledging their role in maintaining or challenging this system. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous standing ovation. Law students cheered. Even some of the older lawyers stood, nodding in agreement. Margaret remained seated, clapping softly. She watched as Imani accepted the acclaim with grace, but without smiling. This wasn't a celebration for her. This was a call to action. From her spot in the shadows, Margaret finally understood. She hadn't just sentenced Imani to prison all those years ago. She had tried to silence a voice that needed to be heard. A voice that was now speaking truth to power without fear or hesitation. And all Margaret could do was listen, and learn, and acknowledge her part in the system that Imani was working to change. The city streets were quiet as Margaret walked away from the legal summit, her heels echoing against the concrete. Streetlights cast long shadows, and a cool breeze carried the rustling of fallen leaves. She pulled her coat tighter, more for comfort than warmth. Outside a brightly lit bookstore, a group of black teenagers huddled around a phone, their laughter floating through the evening air. One girl gestured excitedly about something on the screen while her friends nodded eagerly. Margaret slowed her pace, watching them. These were the faces she'd seen in her courtroom, young lives she'd judged without truly seeing them. Through the window of a small cafe, a young mother bent over a textbook with her child, pointing at something on the page. The child's face lit up with understanding. Margaret remembered how many families she'd torn apart, how many children had lost their mothers to her harsh sentences. A woman in a crisp suit climbed the courthouse steps, case files tucked under her arm. She couldn't have been more than 35. One of the new judges, Margaret guessed. There was determination in her stride, purpose in her movements. She represented everything Margaret should have been but wasn't. Margaret's fingers brushed against her phone in her pocket. Imani's words from the summit still rang in her ears. Justice is not about power. It's about truth. For decades, Margaret had confused the two, wielding her power like a shield against the truth. She thought about Ben, about how close he'd come to becoming another statistic. She thought about Imani, about the brilliant future she'd almost destroyed. She thought about all the names, so many names, that she'd signed onto conviction papers without a second thought. These streets used to feel different. She'd walk them with her head high, proud of her reputation as the toughest judge in the district. People would step aside, whisper her name with respect, tinged with fear. Now she passed like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarkable. Maybe this was justice, she thought, to become invisible in the very world where she'd once held so much power, to watch life continue without her influence, to know that her legacy would be a cautionary tale rather than an inspiration. She found herself at the courthouse steps where she'd presided for so many years. The grand doors loomed above her, illuminated by security lights. How many times had she climbed these steps, convinced of her own righteousness? How many lives had she changed with the bang of her gavel? Margaret stared at those doors for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she turned away. She didn't belong there anymore, and for the first time, she was okay with that. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the morning light filtering through half-drawn curtains. The house felt cavernous now, each room echoing with memories of a life she no longer recognized. A stack of unopened letters cluttered the counter, thick envelopes filled with anger, thin ones containing cold dismissals from former colleagues too afraid to stand beside her. The mail slot creaked and several envelopes fluttered to the floor. Margaret watched the mail carrier's shadow pass by her front window. With a heavy sigh, she stood to collect them, expecting more of the same. Bills. Hate mail. Perhaps another organization removing her name from their records. But one envelope caught her eye. Plain white, no return address. Just her name and address in neat, precise handwriting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing one sentence. You were right about one thing. Actions have consequences. I'm still living with mine. Now, so are you. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She knew that handwriting. Controlled, deliberate. Imani. The paper shook in her hands. The front door opened and Elaine walked in. She'd been keeping her distance lately, but still checked in occasionally, driven more by duty than desire. She paused when she saw her mother's expression. "What is it?" Elaine asked, her voice carrying a mix of concern and lingering resentment. Margaret couldn't speak. She just set the letter down on the table, her movements mechanical. The words burned in her mind. So simple, yet they carried the weight of years of injustice, of lives altered, of power misused. For the first time in years, perhaps the first time since she was a young girl, Margaret began to cry. Not the dignified tears she'd shown at funerals or retirement parties. These were raw, ugly sobs that shook her entire body. She wept for Imani, for every person she'd sentenced without truly seeing them. She wept for Ben, who'd nearly become another statistic. She wept for herself, for the person she'd become, for the justice she'd failed to deliver. There would be no redemption for her, no forgiveness to wash away her sins. There was only this, the crushing weight of consequences, finally settling on her shoulders. Margaret sat in the back row of the community law clinic, her shoulders hunched to make herself smaller. The room buzzed with young energy, law students huddled around worn tables, their laptops open and legal texts spread before them. Their voices carried passion she had never heard in her own courtroom. The system is designed to pressure innocent people into plea deals, a young woman explained, her dark curls bouncing as she gestured. We have to fight that. Margaret watched them work, their determination both inspiring and painful to witness. This was what justice should have looked like all along, not the cold efficiency she had prized for so many years. A young black mother approached one of the student desks, clutching a manila folder to her chest. Her voice trembled. My son. He's only 17. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but they're trying to charge him as an adult. Margaret's chest tightened. How many mothers had stood before her bench speaking those exact words? How many times had she dismissed their pleas with a wave of her hand? He's a good boy, the mother continued, pulling out school records and character references. He has a scholarship waiting. This could ruin everything. The law student leaned forward, taking notes with genuine concern. We'll look into every possible defense. Your son's future matters. Margaret's hand shook as she opened her checkbook. The numbers she wrote were significant. enough to fund several cases. She signed it simply M. Caldwell, careful to keep her handwriting neat but unremarkable. Standing slowly, she approached the front desk where a tired receptionist sorted through paperwork. Margaret placed the check on the counter. "For the defense fund," she said quietly. "No recognition needed." The receptionist glanced at the amount and started to speak, but Margaret was already walking away, pushing through the glass doors into the bright morning sun. She paused on the sidewalk, watching through the window as the young mother hugged the law student, hope replacing fear in her eyes. Margaret would never know if her donation helped that specific case. She would never know if any of her attempts at atonement made a difference. But maybe, she thought, watching the next generation of lawyers fight for justice with such fierce dedication, they would do better than she ever did. Maybe that was the only redemption she deserved, to fade away while others built something better from the ashes of her mistakes. The wooden benches of courtroom 4A creaked softly as Margaret settled into her seat in the last row. The familiar smell of polished wood and leather briefcases filled the air, but everything else felt different. She was just another face in the gallery now, watching as justice unfolded without her influence. Imani Douglas strode to the center of the courtroom, her navy suit crisp and commanding. Her client, James Turner, sat at the defense table, a 16-year-old boy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. His shoulders trembled slightly beneath his borrowed suit jacket. Judge Cynthia Reynolds adjusted her glasses, actually listening as Imani presented her case. The prosecution's evidence relies entirely on a witness statement that contradicts surveillance footage, Imani argued, her voice clear and confident. They want you to believe my client was dealing drugs when the video clearly shows him waiting for a bus. Margaret watched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She remembered similar cases in her own courtroom, young black defendants with shaky evidence against them. How many times had she ignored such obvious holes in prosecution arguments? How many lives had she ruined with her willful blindness? The prosecutor fumbled through his rebuttal, but Imani was ready. She produced timestamp after timestamp, witness statement after witness statement, dismantling the case with surgical precision. Judge Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, taking notes. James Turner's mother sat in the front row, clutching her purse, hope dawning on her face as Imani spoke. Margaret remembered Ben's case, remembered Elaine's tears. She remembered Imani's own mother, devastated in her courtroom years ago. The state has failed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt, Judge Reynolds declared, her voice firm but fair. The charges against James Turner are dismissed. The courtroom erupted in muffled sobs of relief. James hugged his mother, tears streaming down both their faces. Imani gathered her papers calmly, satisfaction evident in the slight curve of her lips. Margaret felt tears prick at her own eyes. This was justice, real justice, not the harsh, biased version she had dealt out for so many years. She watched as James walked out of the courtroom a free young man, his future still intact. Imani never once glanced toward the back of the room. She didn't need to. Her victory spoke volumes without acknowledgement. Margaret stood quietly, smoothing her skirt. The courtroom doors felt heavier as she pushed them open, stepping out into the hallway. She didn't belong here anymore. And for the first time, that felt right. The marble halls of the state Supreme Court echoed with hushed whispers and camera clicks. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Imani Douglas stood before the Chief Justice, her hand placed firmly on the Bible, her voice clear and unwavering. "I, Imani Douglas, do solemnly swear." The words carried weight, not just the official oath, but the journey behind them. The packed courtroom watched in reverent silence. Young law students, seasoned attorneys, and civil rights activists filled every bench. They weren't just witnessing a swearing-in ceremony, they were watching history being made. In her office later that afternoon, Imani found a small newspaper clipping on her desk. The headline was modest, tucked away in the legal notices section. Former Judge Margaret Caldwell dies at 82. Her eyes skimmed the carefully worded obituary, known for her controversial rulings, later advocacy for reform, complicated legacy. Imani didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't frown. She simply folded the clipping neatly and opened her filing cabinet. Inside, a drawer labeled Past Cases held hundreds of files. each one a life touched, changed, or saved by her work. She slipped Margaret's obituary inside and closed the drawer with a soft click. The walk to her new courtroom felt surreal. Her footsteps echoed differently now. Not the nervous shuffle of a wrongly accused teenager, but the confident stride of a justice. The wooden doors opened before her. The seal of the state gleamed behind the bench. Her bench. Imani adjusted her robes and took her seat. The courtroom rose in respect, not out of fear, as they once did for Margaret, but out of genuine reverence. She lifted the gavel, its weight familiar in her hand. This wasn't just her moment. It was a moment for every person who'd been wrongly convicted, every family torn apart by bias, every dream deferred by injustice. The gavel fell. The sound rang clear and true through the courtroom. The cycle was broken. If you enjoyed the story of Imani, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.